Okay, good evening. Thanks for coming once again. And last week I was saying thanks very much for coming in the lovely weather. And this week I'm saying thanks for coming in this horrible thunder and lightning storm we're experiencing. So today I'm going to talk about the Republican hunger strikes of 1923. And like the previous weeks, if you have any questions or comments, I'll be finished with the talk in about 45 minutes, but I'd love to hear your questions or comments, whether you're here in person or watching online on Zoom. On the 24th of May 1923, the anti-treaty IRA called an end to the Civil War by ordering its members to dump their arms. In a letter to members on that date, the anti-treaty IRA Chief of Staff, Frank Aiken, wrote, "Comrades, the arms with which we have fought the enemies of our country are to be dumped. The foreign and domestic enemies of the Republic have for the moment prevailed." Eamon de Valera, president of the underground Republican government at the time, sent a message on the same day to the soldiers of liberty, legions of the rear guard, writing, "The Republic can no longer be defended successfully by your arms. Further sacrifices on your part would now be in vain, and continuance of the struggle in arms unwise in the national interest. Military victory must be allowed to rest for the moment with those who have destroyed the Republic. Other means must be sought to safeguard the nation's right." And here's a subsequent cartoon from the satirical magazine Punch, depicting Ireland's evil genius, de Valera, saying to a woman representing Ireland or Erin, "Much as I love you, I am compelled by circumstances to leave you, but only for a time," to which Erin wearily responds, "Well, make it as long as you can." De Valera told Mary McSweeney, who remained firmly opposed to surrendering, as she saw it, "You speak as if we were dictating terms and talks of a military situation. There is no military situation. The situation now is that we have to shepherd the remnant of our forces out of this fight, so as not to destroy whatever hope remains in the future by allowing the fight to peter out ignominiously." And here is de Valera and Mary McSweeney standing immediately to his left in Paris for the Irish Race Congress in January 1922. The dumping of arms by Republicans is considered the moment when the Civil War hostilities came to an end. Free State Home Affairs Minister Kevin O'Higgins warned in the Dáil in June, though, there is going to be a pretty ugly aftermath to this whole business. Although the Civil War was over, there was a heightening of tensions between Republicans and Free Staters. Tom McEllistrom, who became a Sinn Féin TD in August 1923 and a key member of the anti-treaty IRA in Kerry, claimed he fought until September 1923, saying a few men in Kerry were killed after the dump arms. "At the time of the dump arms, we put away our guns, but we had to take them up again for protection." Violence continued beyond May elsewhere too, including extrajudicial killings by Free State forces, which went unpunished. 3 such deaths occurred in Dublin, according to John Dorney. Henry McEntee was found dead in a field in Finglas on 31st of July, most probably killed by CID men who picked him up on Pearse Street. The most notorious death was that of Noel Lamass, father of future Taoiseach Sean. Noel disappeared from his workplace in July 1923, arrested by a man in plain clothes, armed with a heavy black revolver. His body, shot, mutilated, and badly decomposed, was found in the Dublin Mountains in October 1923. And here's a memorial to Noel Lamass in the Dublin Mountains. John Dorney stated that his funeral was a major display of public grief for the anti-treatyites in Dublin, one of the first since the Civil War on 17th of October 1923. Over 1,500 Republicans marched to his graveside at Glasnevin, and volleys of revolver shots were fired over the grave in a demonstration that was probably representative of all the pent-up grief and fury on their side. The chief suspect was James Murray, a captain in the CID, who was convicted of murder for another extrajudicial killing in December 1923, that of Joseph Bergen. Bergen was a Free State soldier from Camross and Laois. He was found dead at a canal near Milltown in Kildare, riddled with bullets. Believed to be an anti-treaty IRA intelligence officer, he was apprehended by Free State soldiers who interrogated and tortured him in a hut nearby. He was tied to the rear of a car and dragged at speed along the road while still alive. He was then shot and the body dumped in the canal. His blood-stained cap was later thrown into the hallway of the home of his girlfriend. Many Republicans were unable to attend the funerals of other Republicans, such as Noel Lemass, as they remained imprisoned or internment camps, which many were even arrested after the dumping of arms in May. And here are Republican prisoners being rounded up by National Army soldiers in 1923. Senior Republican military figures, Liam Pilkington and Humphrey Murphy, were arrested, as was Eamon de Valera in August 1923, as he was about to address an election rally in Ennis in County Clare. He was whisked away to Arbour Hill. Here's an image from the Illustrated London News showing the stormy petrel of Ireland caged at last, de Valera's arrest. And here he is before his arrest that day. De Valera, by then, believed what was needed was a sustainable electoral pitch by Republicans. He strongly urged participation in the August 1923 general election, even though it was a contradiction of the policy of non-recognition of the Free State. The same could be said of Sinn Féin's participation in the first Northern Ireland election in 1921, an election within a political entity all shades of nationalism did not recognise. As time would tell, Republicans and de Valera benefited ultimately by embracing electoral politics. Peadar O'Donnell, a Republican prisoner, was transferred from Finner Camp in Donegal to Mountjoy shortly after the dumping of arms. Writing in his memoir, The Gates Flew Open, believed the general election was called for August 1923, as the Free Staters now consider the time opportune to have the general election. Everything seems favourable. The IRA had been defeated, the country was scarred with broken bridges, the press was full of statements of the damage that was done, all the money we had looted from the banks, the pulpits were still full of gentlemen following the gentle ways of my missioner in Finner, who was a critic of Republicans. Even though he was incarcerated at the time, as were many other Republican candidates, O'Donnell was elected as a TD in the Donegal constituency in the 1923 general election. Fellow Mountjoy prisoner Ernie O'Malley was also elected as a TD for the Dublin North City constituency, even though he protested at being put forward as a candidate. He did find it amusing, though, that the second preference votes of the Free State Minister for Defence, Dick Mulcahy, had given me my quota. How could one arrive at the point of view which gave him first preference and myself second? Republicans also claimed of intimidatory tactics adopted by the Free State during the election. As this Sinn Féin poster from the election asserted, Sinn Féin was not allowed to distribute leaflets in constituencies. People putting up posters were attacked and Sinn Féin offices were gutted. It asked, shall England claim that the Irishmen of 1923, alone of all white races, voted away their country's independence? Never. Vote for Sinn Féin and your own unpartitioned republic. Here's another election poster from Republicans warning that voting for the Free State means keeping Ireland down. Don't prolong the agony, vote Republican. O'Donnell wrote that our friends outside with a stubborn loyalty dived into the elections. Most of the work indeed was done by women. The letters into prisons gave details of the terrorism to which they were being subjected, and it all prepared us for a crushing defeat at the polls. Despite the obstacles faced by Republicans, and even though most of the public opposed the Republican campaign during the Civil War, there was much revulsion at some of the tactics adopted by the Free State government during and after the conflict, resulting in a far better outcome for Republicans than most people expected. Many voted for Republicans in the August 1923 general election, winning just under 289,000 votes and 44 seats, an increase of 5.6% from the June 1922 general election. Here are the sons of de Valera and the by then executed Erskine Childers addressing an election rally on O'Connell Street in Dublin. Of the 44 elected, 18 were in prisons or camps around the country. Ernie O'Malley claimed in his Civil War memoir, The Singing Flame, that many expected that only 10 or 12 Republican candidates will be elected. Republicans did particularly well in places like Kerry and Sligo, where Free State measures were considered the most extreme, demonstrating a bitterness towards Free State tactics that prevailed. Of the 7 TDs elected in Kerry, 4 were Republicans. Republicans did less well in urban locations and areas less affected by the Civil War. They only won 17% of the vote in Dublin. Out of the 153 seats, 5 were won by women. Mary McSweeney, Countess Markovics, Kathleen Lynn, Kathleen Brewer, and Margaret Collins O'Driscoll. Collins O'Driscoll, sister of Michael Collins, a pro-Treaty Irish candidate, was the only woman not elected under the Republican umbrella. The pro-treaty faction of Sinn Féin had been rebranded as Cumann na Gael earlier in 1923. It won 63 seats and 415,000 votes, increasing its vote share by 0.5% from the 1922 election. Some of its key figures, W.T. Cosgrave, Kevin O'Higgins, and Richard Mulcahy, won huge personal endorsements in their constituencies, with O'Higgins having just transferred his constituency from Laois Offaly to County Dublin before the 1923 general election. While the election showed to Republicans that there was an electoral and constitutional path available to them, it also legitimised the Free State's existence. Even though there were some, there could not be the same level of accusations of British threats of it being an unfair and unfree election as there had been in June 1922. Here you can see Gardaí protecting ballot boxes in a jaunting car. The election was a crushing blow for the Labour Party, which had won 17 seats and over 21% of the vote in 1922. In 1923, its vote share halved to 10.6%, losing 3 seats in the process. Here's a poster for William O'Brien, who failed to retain his seat for the Labour Party in Dublin City South. Of the election results, newly elected TD Pat O'Donnell wrote, "The results startled us. The official Treaty Party only defeated the official Republican Party by a narrow margin. The stubborn resistance of the mass of national opinion was no myth. We went half wild with delight in the prisons. They were whacked. We hadn't lost. After all the killings, jailings, and terrorism, the mass of national opinion was still resisting the treaty. The road back was going to be shorter than we had dared hope. Tiredness was cast off like an old top coat. A new enthusiasm sparkled everywhere. Reorganisation talk began feverishly. We felt too that our release was now a remote thing, that there was too much resistance left in the country to risk letting the prisoners loose. This assertion seemed to be borne out by the reaction of Eoin O'Duffy, Chief of Staff of the National Army, who was perturbed that the successes of anti-treaty Sinn Féin in the general election of August 1923 have undoubtedly given a fillip to their military activities. Huge numbers of Republicans remained incarcerated beyond the general election in August. As there was no negotiated settlement with Republicans dumping arms to fight another day instead of surrendering them, there was no large-scale prison releases, with 12,000 people still imprisoned or interned after the war had ended, including 500 women. And here are Republican prisoners in Tralee Jail in July 1922. Much to the ire of many Free State supporters, a lot of the agitation to have Republican prisoners and internees either released or treated more humanely came from women, and particularly from the Women's Prisoners Defence League, WPDL, which was founded shortly after the Civil War started in the summer of 1922, with Charlotte Despard becoming president and Maud Gonn McBride becoming secretary. The WPDL remained in existence years after the Civil War had ended, committed to fighting for better conditions for Republican prisoners. The movement started as relatives, particularly mothers, daughters, sisters, gathered outside the prisons and barracks where Republicans were imprisoned. Here's a painting from Jack B. Yeats called "Communicating with Prisoners," showing a group of women calling up to women prisoners in Kilmainham Jail. It was from outside Mountjoy Jail that the WPDL movement was founded. According to historian Margaret Ward, Maud Gonn McBride's son Sean was one of those captured after the fall of the Four Courts. She and Sarah Mellows, the mother of Liam, began to talk as they stood with the rest of the crowd. The idea for the Women's Prisoners Defence League was born. It was generally acknowledged that without their vigilant presence, the conditions of the prisoners would have been much worse. They also organised hunger strikes outside the prisons. By relentless pressure continuing over a sustained period of time, the WPDL became a considerable thorn in the side of the Free State government. Writing in 1924, Charlotte Despard, reflecting on the year 1923 alone, felt they had been protesting the whole time. Meetings on O'Connell Street Sundays, in spite of machine guns, have gone on regularly. We have had processions, poster parades, vigils at prison doors, letters to the papers, home and foreign. Possibly, if we had held our tongues, things would have been worse than they are. We know the agitation has kept up the courage of our boys and girls in prison. At the meetings held each Sunday from noon, on top of Despard and Gonn McBride, who bought a house together at Roebuck House in Clonskee, Other prominent anti-treaty activists, such as Helena Maloney, Anna Sheehy Skeffington, Rosamund Jacob, and Dorothy McArdle, took part and spoke at these weekly demonstrations. According to Mary Comerford, were treated with official violence, battened, fired on, and one killed, but nothing stopped them. The person she was referring to who was killed was Lily Bennett, a domestic servant who lived in Ockram Street, who was shot and fatally wounded on 19th of November 1922. Here is Lily Bennett's death certificate. And here's a great image that I found in a French website of a protest held after the executions of Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Richard Barrett, and Joel McKelvey in December 1922, where you could just about make out Despard and Guy McBride, who could be seen at the makeshift speaking platform in the centre. And here are some other images of women holding mock coffins for Rory O'Connor and Richard Barrett. A key component of the WPDL's tactics was the lobbying of public bodies, such as Dublin Corporation and Dáil Éireann, to highlight the treatment of prisoners since the start of the Civil War. This involved working with councillors and TDs to put forward motions, directly addressing meetings, and if this was not possible, protesting from the galleries. After one scene in the Dáil Gallery involving Despard, Guy McBride, and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in September 1922, the chairman of the provisional government, W.T. Cosgrave, said it was possible that a person, particularly a lady, might lose control through emotion. But what occurred that day appeared to be a concerted movement on the part of the three persons responsible. He thought that the Dáil would agree that the presence of persons so inclined could not be tolerated. Here's a poster from the WPDL issued in 1923, highlighting many of the claims of torture meted out against Republican prisoners and internees by Free State authorities. Dublin Corporation supported a number of motions put forward by WPDL member Sheehy Skeffington, seeking better treatment of Republicans in jails and camps. The corporation also supported a motion in April 1923 requesting the government to release Gon McBride, whose great service to the country are well known. She has now been 14 days on hunger strike and is very weak, as well as 3 other women who are also on hunger strike. Here's some images of Anne-Marie McSweeney, an open-air hunger strike outside Mountjoy Jail in solidarity with her sister Mary's hunger strike in the prison. When Mary McSweeney was in prison in Mountjoy Jail in November 1922, she immediately went on hunger strike. Her hunger strike, almost exactly 2 years since her brother Terence had died from the most prominent hunger strike of the Irish independence struggle, was a severe test for the Free State government. Prohibited from visiting her sister, Annie joined Mary on hunger strike outside the jail. She wrote, "If either or both of us die, our blood will be upon your head. You may say I am not in prison, but I am imprisoned by their torturing humanity, and I shall never be released until that prison is opened. Do not imagine my sister, or I fear death." After 20 days on hunger strike, Mary McSweeney was given the last rites. Under enormous pressure, the government finally relented and released her on 28th of November. Mary McSweeney was rearrested in April 1923, along with fellow TD Kate O'Callaghan, on their way to the funeral of anti-treaty IRA Chief of Staff Liam Lynch. Maud Gon McBride was arrested on the same day. All 3 joined a hunger strike of Cummanamon members imprisoned in Mountjoy and Kilmainham jails. While Gon McBride was released, the other women were transported to specially arranged dormitories in the former workhouse of the North Dublin Union. Obstructing the removal to the North Dublin Union, Dorothy McArdle later wrote, "I had been dragged from the railings, a great hand closed on my face, blinding and stifling me, and thrust me back down to the ground, among trampling feet." Despite pleas from many, including from pro-treaty supporters, such as former TD Patrick McCartan, who asked the government not to allow these misguided prisoners to die, we are now practically at the end of this hideous struggle, and magnanimity will do more to heal the sores opened by it than any show of strength. The government stood firm, with Cosgrave replying to McCartan, associating any act of grace as a weakness, and claiming that Republican women were the mainstay of the trouble we have had. I fear that it is not possible to consider these women as ordinary females. Despite pleas from his family, Richard Mulcahy refused clemency from his own sister-in-law, Nell Ryan. Many of the women who embarked on the hunger strike in April 1923 suffered long-term health effects because of it later. as did many who embarked on the large-scale hunger strike in October. Mary Cummins from Kilkenny, who endured 30 days of hunger strike in Kilmainham, was being treated a decade later for chronic gastritis, flatulence, and rheumatic pains. She also suffered from chronic anemia. Helen Walsh, briefly on hunger strike, was dead within 4 years. More and more in Dublin Corporation supported the WPDL as imprisonment and internment continued, despite the ending of the Civil War in May 1923. And as it had done with its policy and executions, regardless of the considerable opposition from many of its supporters, the Free State government resisted all calls to release Republicans long after the conflict was over. To release the prisoners, it was argued, would risk the reopening of hostilities, and there was the danger of a link-up between disaffected Free State troops, Republican units, and neutral IRA members. The Free State government chose to release the prisoners and internees in stages, according to the danger they felt they posed. For Republicans, the rate of release was too slow, with most fearing they would not meet the criteria for release. The government also had to deal with what was described as passive irregularism, such as seizure of land and stocks. Relinquishing none of its hardline stance, the government introduced a new public order bill in June 1923, granting powers to intern and introducing flogging for arson and robbery. The use of flogging, the most criticised element of the draconian Special Powers Acts brought into Northern Ireland in 1922, including by members of the Free State Provisional Government at the time, came in for particularly harsh condemnation. Playwright George Bernard Shaw wrote in July 1923 that there was no possible excuse for the abominable practice of judicial flogging, which is simply a vicious mania abhorrent to all highly civilized peoples. Are we to plunge into this barbarism and to ask the Irish warders for half a crown to degrade themselves and their fellow countrymen in one of those prison scenes which sicken everyone who witnesses them? Flogging never yet put down anything but the credit of the countries which have let themselves be frightened into stooping to it. Kevin O'Higgins believes, though, that when you come face to face with stark anarchy, worse still, if it masquerades as political idealism, you've got to be reactionary. The biggest problem for the Free State authorities and the Republican leadership was the continued retention of the 12,000 Republicans in jail beyond the ceasefire. Unsure of when release dates would come from what were considered very poor conditions in the prisons and camps around the country, and disillusionment within the Republican leadership, morale amongst the prisoners and internees was at an extremely low ebb. Enticed by the WPDL and Eamon de Valera, a delegation from the International Committee of the Red Cross visited the Irish Free State in April and May 1923 to inspect prisons and internment camps to verify or not the claims by Republicans that the Free State was breaking the laws of war by their methods of warfare and their treatment of Republican prisoners. The Red Cross delegation was met by Free State External Affairs Minister Desmond Fitzgerald, who insisted that there was no war in Ireland. It was a police operation involving over 10,000 prisoners. This tactic was similar to ones used by the British during the War of Independence, who refused to recognise they were fighting a war in Ireland. Red Cross delegates visited Mountjoy, Gormanstown, Tintown in the Curragh, and Newbridge, and concluded that prisoners were being held in conformity with international legal principles. Here are the Red Cross reports from Tintown internment camp and Mountjoy prison. The subsequent publication of the Red Cross's report in the International Red Cross Journal was a propaganda coup for the Free State government. Republicans believed the report was worthless, and the Red Cross only visited what they described as show camps, even alleging the Red Cross visit has made prison and camp conditions worse by claiming incidents of torture and indefinite detention, even though the conflict had ended. Not all Republican internees believed they were mistreated, though, with writer Frank O'Connor, who was having grave doubts about the Republican cause in general, was surprised on his arrival at Gormanstown camp in April 1923 to receive hospitable treatment from his Free State captors, and claimed he was provided with sufficient food and shelter, and the internees were allowed to govern themselves. For other Republicans, there were regional tensions in the prisons, contended with too, with one internee, John Cullinan from Dublin No. 1 Brigade, referring to Cork men who would only obey their own officers. It was also very hard to impose discipline within prisons, as internees were regularly moved to different prisons or camps around the country. After being involved in an attempt to break out of Mountjoy, Padder O'Donnell was one of 12 prisoners hoisted into lorries and driven across Dublin City. He only found out on arrival that he was being sent to Arbor Hill. There was also undue pressure on internees to sign the form and accept the legitimacy of the Free State. O'Donnell recalled that the men were fidgety and dangerous. The demand for release was rising daily, and the jail was more on everybody's nerves than I had ever seen it. The annoyances were being piled up. He had been moved back from Arbor Hill to Mountjoy again by that stage. It was in these conditions that Republicans decided to embark on a large-scale hunger strike to highlight their plight. O'Donnell wrote, "I don't know where the hunger strike talk jumped from, but it was soon all over the jail." The hunger strike had been a potent weapon during the War of Independence for otherwise powerless prisoners, through either forcing the British to back down or as a powerful means of propaganda if hunger strikers were to pay the ultimate sacrifice and die. The 1916 Easter Rising's championing of self-sacrifice, as articulated through the words and actions of Pádraig Pearse, resonated with those fighting for Irish independence from there on in. Pearse had helped to generate a renewed interest in mythological figures, particularly that of arguably the most famous folk hero of all, Cuchulainn, who was willing to sacrifice his life for Ireland, as depicted in this statue based on the GPO. Hunger striking had been a form of sacrifice much in use at the time, particularly within the suffragette movements in Ireland and Britain. The death of Thomas Ashe in September 1917, after being force-fed while on hunger strike in Mountjoy, changed the mood and mind of Ireland almost overnight, according to his biographer, Sean O'Loughlin. Hunger strikes were a major weapon used by IRA volunteers during the War of Independence. In most instances, fearing an international and public backlash, the British authorities relented and released hunger strikers before prisoners succumbed. After a hunger strike in October 1919, 47 men were released from Mountjoy. Last can be seen here leaving Mountjoy, accompanied by the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Lawrence O'Neill. Hunger strikes continued and even escalated in 1920, with many prisoners feeling pressurised to embark on one. Todd Andrews, seen here with De Valera, who joined the hunger strike in April 1920, doing so again in October 1923, felt there was not much choice for prisoners, saying it was an error to think that hunger strikers participated voluntarily. The moral pressure deriving from the wish and the need to show solidarity with one's comrades is so powerful as to amount to an order. Same pressure was felt by prisoners in October 1923. The hunger strike of April 1920 was a huge success for the strikers, fully backed by the Irish public, can be seen by the crowds outside Mountjoy here, backed by the Catholic hierarchy and the Irish Trades Union Congress, who called a general strike. The British relented and released 90 prisoners from Mountjoy that month. Maurice Crowe and Michael Carolan recovering in the Mater Hospital after Mountjoy hunger strike had ended. One of the hunger strikers, Francis Aidan Gleeson, died weeks after he was released from Mountjoy though. Emboldened, more nationalist internees went on hunger strike at Wormwood Scrubs in London the following month, with the British authorities relenting again by releasing 200 of them. Here's a man speaking to hunger strikers with a megaphone outside Wormwood Scrubs. According to William Murphy, these were humiliations which the government could not indefinitely endure and retain either authority or the capacity to use imprisonment as an effective weapon against the IRA. As one of the many measures from the summer of 1920 of a hardened policy towards Ireland, the British authorities changed tact and refused to release prisoners or give in to their demands once a hunger strike had started. When the hunger strike began in Cork in August 1920, in the words of William Murphy again, a ghoulish, fatal contest unfolded. 3 prisoners died in October: Michael Fitzgerald, Joseph Murphy, and the Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence McSweeney, whose death totally eclipsed the deaths of the other 2 men. While Arthur Griffith ordered the Cork prisoners to call off their strikes, and there were no more fatalities by hunger strike until the Civil War, the propaganda value for Sinn Féin, particularly by the death and funeral of Terence McSweeney, was huge. No other event in Ireland generated more international media coverage than the death and funeral of McSweeney in 1920, including Bloody Sunday and the burning of Cork. The Times of London predicted that his death will be infinitely more eloquent and infinitely more subversive of peace than he himself ever could be. His words, as written in this memorial in Glasnevin Cemetery, two Republican hunger strikers who died in Ireland in the 20th century. It is not those who can inflict the most, but those who can suffer the most who will conquer, have resonated with many on this island and far beyond ever since. And here's a famous illustration from the Le Petit Journal in France, depicting the dying Maxwini. There is no doubt that the hunger strikes from the War of Independence that resulted in the British relenting or gaining extensive international exposure, if they did conclude to their bitter end, and the hunger strikes carried out by Republican women during the Civil War were major factors in Republicans deciding to embark on their hunger strike in October 1923. There was even some encouraging news of exposure from abroad shortly after the hunger strike started, with the same French publication, Le Petit Journal, whose illustration of Maxwini in 1920 had done much to catapult his story into international headlines, when it published a front cover illustration of the Republican hunger strike in Mountjoy in October 1923, following the example of the Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence Maxwini. The caption below the image translates as 424 Irish locked up in Mountjoy prison in Dublin have been refused their release, decided to go on hunger strike. In vain do the guards try to make them give in by presenting them with abundant food. Since October 14, the prisoners have perished in their fierce resolution, have persisted in their fierce resolution. Without any coordinated plan within the Republican movement, prisoners in Mountjoy took the initiative themselves and went on hunger strike on the 13th of October 1923, not the 14th as reported by Le Petit Journal, as a protest against prison conditions and the continuation of their internment. Michael Kilroy, OC of the Republican prisoners in Mountjoy, claimed the hunger strike in Mountjoy had been decided upon under incessant and desperate provocation. Each of us to himself and to his comrades solemnly pledges himself to abstain from food until he is released. In taking this grave decision, we as citizens of Ireland know that lovers of human liberty the world over will understand and respect our motives. Kilroy was also a Republican TD for Mayo, one of 11 Republican TDs who embarked on the hunger strike. The others were Ernie O'Malley, Charles Muffy, Austin Stack, Sean Buckley, Dr. Patrick McCarville, Daniel Corkery, Thomas Derry, Gerald Boland, Herbert Mellows, and Pat O'Donnell. The anti-treaty IRA Chief of Staff, Frank Aiken, stated that the Mountjoy prisoners had gone on hunger strike for unconditional release, and the prisoners in other jails and camps would probably do likewise. He called on all volunteers to organise and discipline themselves and to organise the people around them to ensure that the sufferings and sacrifices of their dead comrades and the hunger strikers should not have been in vain. At the Sinn Féin Ardech, which was held in October 1923, as expressions of solidarity with the Republican hunger strikers, it was decided to observe a fast by all Republicans on Thursday next, 25th of October, the third anniversary of the death from hunger strike in Brixton of Terence Maxwini, to abstain from alcoholic drinks and to have the rosary recited 7 times on Fridays around places of detention in the various districts. The prisoners in Mountjoy were soon followed by prisoners in other camps, with about 8,000 men and women ultimately going on hunger strike. The figure was made up of 462 hunger strikers in Mountjoy, 70 in Cork Jail, 200 in Dundalk, 350 in Kilkenny, 3,300 in Tintown in the Curragh, 1,700 in Newbridge, 711 in Gormanstown, 1,000 in Hare Park, also in the Curragh, and 50 Republican women prisoners in the North Dublin Union. The watercolour by Countess Markiewicz shows Kathleen Hyland knitting in North Dublin Union in December 1923, shortly after the hunger strike had ended. Markiewicz herself was arrested on 20th of November, joined the hunger strike in North Dublin Union before it was called off 3 days later. The huge number of prisoners who went on hunger strike was in many ways at the root of the campaign's failure. There was criticism within Republican quarters who felt the number of people on hunger strike was way too high, believing the numbers should be limited to carefully selected individuals, people who could be relied upon to follow the hunger strike to the brutal end. Liam Pilkington believed it was hard to get a strike to succeed when there was a big number of men on strike. A hunger strike should consist of picked men only. The strike was poorly planned from the outset, with people unclear of its ultimate goal, when it could be called off, by whom, and on what grounds. Both the political and military leadership of the Republican movement was unaware of it before it started in Mountjoy, including De Valera, he was not asked to take part in the hunger strike. There is De Valera in the centre with Austin Stack to the right in Arbour Hill in early 1924. Stack did embark on the hunger strike. W.T. Cosgrave claimed he only did so as he was shamed by the others into doing it, and it was 48 hours after everyone else had done so. Stack did go on strike later, but he claimed it was due to his stomach trouble, the result of his various imprisonments under the direct British regime in Lewis, Portland, Mountjoy, Dundalk, Belfast, and Manchester jails. He participated in the Ash hunger strike, the Dundalk hunger strike, and he led the famous Belfast hunger strike. In the face of this record and the fact, though withstanding his ill health, he joined the comrades in his fourth hunger strike. The spells of imprisonment and hunger strikes took a big toll on Stack's health. He never recovered, dying at the age of 49 in 1929. While people were allowed to participate or not in the hunger strike, many felt under pressure to take part, a sort of moral conscription. Padre O'Donnell remarked that no one was ordered onto it, but then no one felt they could stay off it. He believed the decision to go on hunger strike was made when none of us knew we had a stomach. Now I have knowledge. Now I have nothing else than a belly with needs that are ready to jump right through my mind. Ernie O'Malley, who took part in the hunger strike, later wrote that he had always disliked such an idea of going on hunger strike because I was afraid of it, and also to me it was an unsoldierly way to die or face death. Despite intense pressure, some like Frank O'Connor did hold out and refused to go on hunger strike. There was much agitation from public bodies, including from bodies who were supporters of the Free State, to release the prisoners. Dublin Corporation unanimously passed a motion for the Lord Mayor to petition the Dáil to release the prisoners illegally. Despite the pressure, the government stood firm and would not yield to the hunger strikers. People who had not renounced violence against the Free State, people who had refused to accept its legitimacy. Speaking in late October, W.T. Cosgrave claimed the hunger strike was a fraud, for when some of the prisoners were examined recently, we found they had brown bread in their pockets and pastilles enough to keep a man alive for 24 hours. That was a sort of hunger strike that was going on, and if these people died, it was themselves who were sentencing themselves to death and not the government. As the hunger strike progressed, news began to filter through of the condition of some of the hunger strikers. Of the 50 women on hunger strike in the North Dublin Union, Sinn Féin's Daily Sheet reported in late October that a greater number of these have been in jail for the past 12 months, and many are quite unfit physically to face the sufferings entailed by the strike. Of this number, 2 are on their 5th hunger strike, 1 on their 4th, 5 on their 3rd, 23 on their 2nd. A day later, the same publication reported that Mrs. M. Cudahy, M. O'Reilly, and M. Coyle are very low. May Zambra, age 17 of Dublin, collapsed on Sunday and is in a precarious position. Although Zambra survived, she too never fully recovered, dying just 6 years later at the age of 23. Ernie O'Malley, who was seriously injured when captured in November 1922, was gravely ill, later stating he seemed to be letting go of my hold on life, for it had been a continuous fight to attempt to regain health under prison conditions. Although O'Malley survived and lived longer than others, dying at the age of 59 in 1957, the remainder of his life was severely impacted by ill health, mainly due to his wounds and prison experiences. With the Free State government standing firm and many of the hunger strikers faltering, within 3 weeks of the commencement of the hunger strike, many started to take food, which caused a domino effect, making it more and more difficult for others to stay on it. Here is the Daily Sheets edition of 1st of November, showing the numbers on hunger strikes had been reduced to just over 5,000. It claimed the numbers had mainly been reduced owing to large batches of releases and promises of immediate release on the part of the authorities. Reality is, though, that many came off the strike long before it was officially called off, 41 days after it commenced on 13th of October, without any guarantee of being released. Sheila Humphreys was on hunger strike for 31 days with about 8 other women. Jack Plunkett and Todd Andrews came off the strike 14 days after the general start, while some others with them in Newbridge had ceased within a few days, and a big crowd of the 2,000 there had ceased within a week of the start. The strike was finally called off on 23rd of November, but it was too late for 2 men, Dennis Barry and Andy O'Sullivan, who died on the 20th and 22nd of November, respectively. Joseph Whitty had died in August 1923 from complications from a hunger strike he embarked on himself, but that was not part of the larger hunger strike from October this is his pension application from his mother. The treatment of Barry by the Catholic Church shows how its views had changed on hunger strikes from 1920 to 1923. When Dennis Barry grew weak in Newbridge jail, Todd Andrews requested the chaplain's attendance, but this was refused. After he died, his family from Cork wanted the body to lie in state in St. Finbarr's Catholic Church overnight before burial at the Republican plot in St. Finbarr's the following day. The Bishop of Cork, Daniel Coughlin, refused, though, nor permitting Barry's body to take him to any church, stating, "I am not allowing religious exercises which constitute Christian burial to take place at the burial of Dennis Barry. I regret very much to feel obliged to adopt this course. Anyone who deliberately takes his own life is deprived of Christian burial, and I shall interpret the law of the church and refuse a Christian burial. I feel bound to do it." This was a marked contrast to the death of Terence McSweeney 3 years earlier, when after elaborate Catholic funeral arrangements in London and Dublin, Bishop Coughlin, with 7 other bishops, especially assembled in Cork for the occasion, had given the fullest of Christian burials to Terence McSweeney. This was clearly a political decision by the bishop, who felt some who died in hunger strike were more worthy than others. During the hunger strike, pressure had been put on the prisoners by priests who claimed their action was tantamount to suicide, and by doctors who refused to treat prisoners unless they came off the strike. The lack of empathy from the Catholic Church demonstrated the difficulties faced by Republicans in trying to gain public support for the hunger strike. One of the reasons it ultimately was a failure. Although many prisoners and internees were released from October to December 1923, with 2,647 prisoners released in November alone, including all women who were incarcerated, many remained in jail until the summer of 1924, particularly those considered the leaders of the Republican movement. Upon release, Republicans faced bleak prospects, demoralised and defeated. Some whose health never recovered from their hunger strike died early deaths. Others, unable to gain a livelihood, were forced to leave Ireland and try and eke out a living elsewhere. So then that concludes the talk. So for next week will be the last section in the series, and I'll be talking about Ireland gaining international recognition, particularly on Ireland's attempts to join the League of Nations. So just on the further reading suggestions, there's some great memoirs and autobiographies of people. I could have mentioned Todd Andrews as well. Dublin Made Me is a very good book, which he calls his experience in jails. But I picked out The Singing Flame by Ernie O'Malley and The Gates Flew Open by Peadar O'Donnell. Between Two Hells, Jim referred to this book. I think the book is okay on the Civil War itself, but you can get other better accounts. But where the book is really good is the aftermath of the Civil War, and not just in the hunger strikes, but also how people lived after the Civil War. Not just the losers, but also the Cumann Gael. How people had to emigrate, how the whole pension process, how people were, particularly women, how they were mistreated in the whole pension process. I think Jim referred to, it's almost the second half of his book is on the aftermath of Civil War. I think that's, for that alone, it's a really good book. It's Between Two Hells by Jim referred to, the last one there. Whereas the other two are memoirs by people who were in prison and went on hunger strike. So that's it. So any questions or comments?